Right. Hello, everyone. Today we have two very special guests, Geo Maher and Adam Elliott-Cooper, and we discuss police violence, and abolition. And we kick off with a very simple question, which should pave the way for this conversation. And the question is what the police are for. And some of the things that we hope to discuss in what follows are the origins of police. So how did human beings at some point in our history come up with police as an essential phenomenon in our lives? And what are the functions of the police back in the days, and how these functions have mutated. So where wants to start? Maybe Adam starts off, because at the end of the day, he's in London, which is the heart of the empire.
Okay, I mean, coming from the rainy heart of empire. And so obviously policing develops in uneven ways across different parts of Europe, particularly across the imperial nations of Europe and then across imperial Europe's various colonies. But I think it's worth noting a few things. First, in the British context, certainly that what we might call proto-policing, or police forces which weren't called the police, they might be called the yeomanry or simply the army, have been around for a very long time. And their purpose was generally to protect property, the property of aristocrats and other landlords and sections of the ruling class, but also, of course, connected to that, to quell or repress peasant rebellions when people demanded better working conditions or lower taxes or other kinds of rights and freedoms and liberties. And we really begin to see these set of institutions becoming more formalized with the emergence of wage labor, right? So people earning money for a living rather than being paid through the products that they or the agricultural products that they are able to yield through their agricultural work, right? And this, I think, is connected to property, but also imperialism and therefore race in a number of ways. The first, of course, is that if people are being paid a wage, then on the places like the docks of London or Liverpool or Bristol in the United Kingdom, property owners and merchants and other sections of the ruling class wanted to prevent their workers from taking any of the products that they were helping to move from one place to another. Right? So this is where we begin to see a police force emerging in places like London. But similarly, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, we also see Britain's police forces or proto-police forces being more formalized in order to control Britain's colonized and particularly its enslaved populations. And this became particularly important for Britain following a number of slave rebellions that took place across the British Caribbean following the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 1700s and the early 1800s. And so on both sides of the Atlantic, we see empire, as well as the emergence of capitalism, playing a crucial role in policing oppressed people, whether they be the working classes of Europe, but also the colonized and enslaved subjects in places across the Americas.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and 100% with the way that Adam has described that history, and just to maybe add a little bit of the U.S. dimension, it's important to always insist that this long history is a history, as Adam's described it, of property and imperial colonialism. And that this is really the long prehistory of the police. And I say it in particular because in the US, there's this sort of a habit of describing the police as, on the one hand, anchored in slavery, but also anchored in the so-called, London model of this sort of professionalized police, which is kind of magically stripped of all of its colonial elements, right? It seems just sort of, abstract model for modern policing. And of course, that was not the case, right? So we've got, this story that police in the northern part of the United States emerged out of this sort of appropriation of a sort of professional, London policing model. And it was more in the South that the police emerged, as many, of the listeners will know, from slave catchers, from those forces that were explicitly designed to control enslaved African people in the southern part of the United States. Of course, it's a sort of reproduction of an American Black legend in which the U.S., the North is sort of free of all sin, and the South is the sort of home of the repressive, racist, prehistory of the police. Of course, it's just simply not true, right? The London model, of course, was derived through colonial and imperial intervention. It, acquired its sort of militarized characteristics, in the U.S., in places like Haiti, Nicaragua, and, in the Philippines, in imperial occupation forces. And those sort of military occupiers then came back and designed the so-called professionalized police across the United States, doing so on military lines, right? And this is no accident, right? Because you've got this long, pattern which persists today, in which certain populations are coded as insurgent military foes, right? Colonized populations, whether internally or externally, Black Americans, Brown Americans, and others, are always seen as subject to and of deserving military force. And so this sort of like intersection with the military and this global piece of contemporary policing even is no accident either. But the two parameters crucial to bear in mind are white supremacy and property. White supremacy itself being a form of property. And I think when we're talking about contemporary policing, it's crucial to maintain a sort of balance between the two, because you can explain in the U.S. context, everything that contemporary police do, or the way that they operate, or their overarching, function, through either of those parameters, right? You've got ways that police operate that they would not if they were simply, servants of capital. Because they also respond so often to white fear, white anxiety, a fear expressed specifically around Black mobility, right? When slaves are ostensibly freed, all of a sudden the police become incredibly important to control the movement of these ostensibly free people through process of criminalization and ultimately convict leasing and mass incarceration. And I think this is something that we can talk about further. I think when we look globally, I think almost sort of uniformly, you see police in every corner of the earth upholding property and whiteness on some level, even in places where this may seem incredibly counterintuitive. In Africa and Asia, you see whiteness anchoring a lot of what's happening, and of course the protection of property being the everyday sort of function.
From what social stratum did originally police officers come from? So I assume they were not aristocrats, and neither they could have been the oppressed peoples. So given that there was no middle class in the times you're referring to, obviously they would represent the interests of the privileged, of the white, and so on, but who were themselves some working class people?
I'm happy to go. I think, yes, historically, police officers have been drawn from the working classes. And maybe if we continue our kind of comparison with slave overseers and what have you, we can see that very often these kinds of, we might call them comprador classes or managers or what have you, are yield taken from the oppressed classes and elevated and given certain privileges. And this has been a fairly consistent tactic, I would say, of ruling classes throughout both feudalism and capitalism, to establish order and maintain order by giving certain privileges to people from oppressed classes. And I think the police is perhaps one of the most salient and consistent examples of this. They receive far more privileges in relation to pay and pensions and other kinds of conditions compared to people who join the military, for instance. They play a really crucial role in maintaining order. And I think it's therefore something which we should think about really carefully when we're thinking about the differences between criticizing individual police officers as people and criticizing the police as an institution.
Yeah, and the question raises, a really interesting historical piece, particularly in the U.S., where And this relates to contemporary debates around, are the police workers? Are they not? Should we organize them as workers? And there are arguments out there. Cedric Johnson in particular has been arguing that we should understand the police as part of this broader working class. Many others on the left, I think, quite rightly see that as a kind of farcical misunderstanding of the way the police operate in practice. But it's got a history, right? Which is that, of course, police were drawn from, in the US, largely poor and working class communities, mostly recent immigrant communities. And they were put to work doing performing a number of functions, including what we'd understand today as policing, but also other sort of social control functions, social welfare functions. Over time, in the early 20th century, there's a wave of strikes, 1919, 1920, in which police go on strike, in many ways to a very destructive end for some cities. And then there's this process whereby those in power are trying to decide, how do we manage this question, right? How do we manage this slightly unruly Achilles heel that we need? In other words, a kind of policing force to maintain our control power, white power. And firstly, one thing that's worth understanding is that becoming the police is part of becoming white in US history, right? Because that means being incorporated into the power structure to oppress and police and oversee others. It's also part of becoming so-called middle class, right? Acquiring a level of stability in your life. And the way that this played out historically is that there were actually what you could understand as real efforts to operate as a labor, a strike, as a union force in certain moments, right? A unionized labor force willing to withhold their own labor, which was contradictory from the beginning because police were simultaneously breaking strikes across the country. They were being used as a kind of Pinkerton style, force of violence to destroy workers' movements. But there was a revolt among police against their managers, against municipal officials. But it was a very short-lived moment. And the result of it was that police were fully incorporated through a series of privileges into the power structure, right? They threatened to be a labor movement, and as a result were sort of given all of the benefits that the system had to give them and the privileges the system had to give them to prevent them from actually being a labor movement. And so they mobilized the sort of threat of becoming labor, as it were, to gain power between the 20s and the 40s. And they simultaneously, in the period after that, mobilized the threat of Black resistance and Black rebellion as a way to further, solidify their position. So they essentially would say, listen, who is going to keep you safe from the Black Power movement, and the sort of riots and rebellions that were sort of breaking out in the mid-1960s. All of that, contributes to this consolidation of the police as an essential part of what is a corporatist, relationship with the state, right? I mean, we know corporatism as a sort of a quasi-fascistic phenomenon where all of these pieces of government are incorporated into one sort of broader structure, and the police are really the glue of that, right? They are, in the US in particular, they can't really go on strike. Technically, they've sacrificed their rights as a labor movement, a short-lived labor movement, to be enforcers of the status quo. As a compensation for that, they get essentially anything they want when it comes to negotiation with local municipal officials, and they still to this day act like kind of blackmailers and bullies when it comes to these kind of negotiation talks. Always, and here you see the real difference, because there are these arguments again about are police workers or not. The police sort of as an employment mode has diverged so radically from the labor movement, right? The wages and salaries have gone up consistently. They've got all these privileges. They're essentially allowed to kill other workers with impunity. And yet the labor movement itself has declined, wages have stagnated. And these things are, take very different trajectories from the 1940s onward.
It seems to me that while structurally the police is not exactly a corporation, well, unless we consider the state to be, the boards, the CEOs and so on. But I looked up carefully studied the website of Australian Federal Police the other day, and the rhetoric mimics word in word corporate rhetoric. There is a, inclusive culture and, incentives for personal growth, and the sense of integrity, the friendly environment, and so everything you will find, all the rhetoric you'll find in any corporation, in any business, you will find on the website of federal police. And in fact, I even knew a couple of philosophers who gave up on philosophy, or who were sacked, and who were considering to become cops, because that is the safest and most secure job you can get. And there's a great demand for police officers at the moment. And something you could do in your leisure time if you're interested, Australian police in Melbourne has erected a new building, new headquarters, which costs $650 million. And it's just mounting over the CBD. And so it looks exactly like Rio Tinto or any of these monstrous conglomerates in terms of its presentation. And the only difference is that the logo is like police. Well, that's a real police state with no skepticism whatsoever. And to me, again, culturally, it's a quite important concern in terms of how the police are presented. Because back in the days, still, when you go in Australia into the country, you see little towns where, there's like one local police officer, everyone knows the person, and there's still a bit of a, kind of family vibe, if you like, while in big cities, it has become completely something else. So the distance between urban cops and regular people is enormous at the moment. So there's a great barrier, if you like, between them. So the question arises, and we'll just move on to the next part of our conversation, is all three of us, share something in common, namely that we're quite pessimistic, I should say, about the role and contemporary status of police in our societies, because they are responsible for a great deal of violence, something that we already intimated. And the way this force is embedded in our community is quite dubious. And the question that we may address is whether police, as it has been sold to us, is the force, the power that brings about social justice and peace. And many would think that this is precisely the case, while many others, not many, a few others would say that this is an obsolete belief. We could just begin by responding to a provocative prompt, which goes as follows, and it will run against a common line of thought of a regular citizen in Australia, possibly to a lesser extent in the UK and the US. Are the police obsolete today?
Yeah, happy to go on this. So I think that when Angela Davis wrote her very influential book, right, about prisons being obsolete, she didn't, I don't think, mean that we can close every prison tomorrow and sack every cop today and everything will immediately get a lot better. What she was actually saying is, look, we don't need police and prisons in order to be safe. What we really need, if we want to create a safe and healthy society, are to erode and get rid of and replace the structures of power and inequality and oppression which lead to people harming others, right? So when Angela Davis says, look, prisons are obsolete, what she means is that, look, if we can create a society which is based on care rather than competition, which is based on mutual aid and solidarity rather than growth and extraction and the profit motive, if we can begin to unlearn forms of patriarchy and racial hierarchy, which make these forms of profit and exploitation possible, then we can create a world in which prisons are obsolete. But unfortunately, it takes a very long time and a lot of work and a huge amount of organization in order for us to be able to create a world in which prisons are obsolete. And therefore, what her and other pioneers of abolitionist thinking propose is that we instead start to build the kinds of alternatives to police and prisons that we can rely on today, that can erode our society's reliance on the police and prison system. And maybe we can talk about some of the examples of that as well.
Yeah, no, I think the idea of obsolescence, right, it operates as a kind of guide to action, right, for someone like Angela Davis, right? How is it that we make police and prisons obsolete? And this in and of itself is a reframing, right? It's a reframing away from the simple tearing down to the question of the building up, right? And this is something that is a global question, of course, but acquires a kind of certain salience in U.S. history, from which, for better or for worse, a lot of the abolitionist movement gets its sort of frames of reference. And to give just a sort of the briefest of overviews, in the course of the Civil War, and here for those, I mean, for everyone, you know, in the U.S. And abroad, but particularly for those that don't know the broad parameters of U.S. history, W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is really this essential text that tells the story of the Civil War as a story of Black revolt against enslavement, of the ways in which enslaved Africans took history into their own hands and made that history and transformed it, changing the outcome and the meaning of the U.S. Civil War, right? It was not Abraham Lincoln who decided to free American slaves. It was slaves who freed themselves through their struggle. However, this ultimate abolition, which was it's a near abolition of slavery in the letter of the law, and I say near abolition because it's got a massive loophole for those who have been convicted of crimes. This near abolition was not matched by a process of social reconstruction. In fact, we refer to the period after the Civil War as Reconstruction, but it was a period of intense struggle, massive opportunity, really the closest the United States has ever been to multiracial democracy. And yet it was destroyed by white terrorism by the mid to late 1870s. It was rolled back. And so ultimately what the United States gets is a sort of abolition without reconstruction, right? The elimination of one institution, for the most part, namely slavery, without rebuilding society in a way that would make that institution obsolete. In other words, the way the social structure, shook out, called new forms of slavery into being, right? Whether it's sharecropping or the criminalization of Blackness through Black codes, leading then to convict leasing, in which many people who had been formerly freed were arrested, convicted, and leased out as quasi-slaves to their, previous, plantation owners and slave masters. In other words, if you don't rebuild society on different foundations, the same old institutions will continue to develop. And you could look at this very concretely today by saying, if we could sort of, with the snap of a finger, the stroke of a pen, eliminate police tomorrow, there would be new kinds of police on the next day. Because we have a world built around, white supremacist fear, property inequalities, patriarchal violence, and there is a requirement for institutions to uphold these things, right? This is a very concrete point, right? Rich people will hire police and hire people to protect their wealth. That's, the immediate consequence of abolishing the police. White people will immediately be fearful and are already sort of in the throes of a sort of decades long fear at increasing steps toward Black freedom. And this calls the police into being unless we rebuild society. Now, I don't think this means that we sort of slow the pace of our demands. I mean, and for me, Minneapolis was a great example of the fact that we had the opportunity and the possibility to actually tear the institution down very quickly through both popular action and municipal action. And those are opportunities that we should take, and we should then build that new society around it, as people did on the ground. More than 1,000 people establishing a liberated zone in the center of Minneapolis, and building up those alternative institutions. This is the sort of double work that we need to be doing in the present and moving forward.
Well, I have quite a few questions. Both responses were quite dense, so maybe we talk a little bit more about conditions for reconstructing, reimagining society, if you like. Obviously, I completely agree with you that people's thinking should be oriented by different values. Living in Australia, it's very hard for me even to imagine how it would become possible without certain things collapsing. But here in Australia, across 5-6 generations, people have been living safely. For several generations, people have been able to enjoy a very easygoing, comfortable lifestyle, and the aspiration to this lifestyle, even though it is based on the same very flawed, contentious foundations, this lifestyle is alluring. And the idea of having this lifestyle of, having your own home, going on holidays, just a work-oriented lifestyle rather than community-oriented lifestyle, is passed down from one generation to another. So it's, even though there are clusters of neighborhoods, for example, around Melbourne, where you see migrants from Africa, from some Asian countries, where situations are quite tricky and they're trying to come here as refugees. But all in all, they are ostracized from the main flow of life. And I just can't see how, without any economic collapse, society here, for example, may find inspiration or may create conditions to convert competition into care, to use one of Adam's examples, and care for one another, obviously, care for the land and things like that. So much of this economy is based on the exploitation of land, which is habitual, right? And so for me, it's hard to imagine how at a personal level people would start thinking differently about organizing themselves into societies of care and mutual concern, rather than societies that are driven exclusively by personal interest and the comfort of their own families. So how do you think something like that may happen in a extremely neoliberal country like Australia? Obviously, there's other examples, Canada, for example.
Okay, I'm happy to go again. So I think that, although obviously I can't speak for the Australian context, Britain is also a fairly neoliberal place. It's certainly, by many accounts, the most neoliberal place in Europe, or Western Europe. But I think there are still pockets in some ways, and in many ways kind of dominant ideas relating to mutual aid and beneficial kinds of supports for each other. I think if we think about something as basic as a national health service, right, the idea that healthcare should be free at the point of access, and that's when we go to work, our taxes, we should be taxed, and that tax should be redistributed for things like healthcare, I think is a basic principle that we should care for each other within our society. And even though we might not need it today, we want to make that kind of social investment, and we all live in a better society when there are things like free healthcare and free secondary education and subsidized transport and things like that. So I think we can think about potentially the welfare state as being one example of this. But crucially as well, I think we can also consider wider forms of care existing within many communities across places like Britain and Europe, and I'm sure even somewhere like Australia, where people engage in forms of mutual aid, where they support each other when there are people who might have forms of disability or mental health problems in their local area, who might not be part of their family necessarily, but provide them with certain kinds of support. There are youth clubs all over cities like London and Birmingham and Manchester in the United Kingdom, where people work for very low wages to support young people in their local area, to try to help them in relation to issues that might be linked to harm or violence or some other things which the police would otherwise be involved in. And we can see the fact that lots of people who probably go to pretty good universities and get good degrees and could become management consultants and earn lots of money, instead decide to go and work for a local community organisation that might be a domestic violence shelter, or it might be support for people who are unhoused, or it might be supporting people who have problems with their mental health. I think this shows that actually a lot of people would much rather do a job which doesn't involve them maximizing their income, but involves instead helping other people, not simply because they might have solidarity with them, but there might actually be something which is which gives people an intrinsic sense of hope about the world when they wake up in the morning, or when they get home from work at night, when they do that kind of work, which they probably wouldn't get if they ended up working for McKinsey or an investment bank or a hedge fund or whatever it is that their degree might help them do.
Yeah, and I think this really grows out in many ways of the previous question, right? Which is to say that we live in a world that I describe as a world of police, right? We live in a world, and this is not simply an ideological phenomenon. It's not simply that we misunderstand our world or misunderstand the need for police in our world, or or anything else. The reality is the world has been built that way, right? It's been built around policing. It's been built around capitalism. It's been built around white supremacy, and those structures are very real and material structures that need to be overcome. But the good thing is this, and this is sort of in some ways the obverse of what Adam was saying, was that it took capitalism a long time to build this world of individual interest, right? It took a lot of work. It was not a natural phenomenon. It's not anchored in any kind of mythical understanding of human nature, and of course, it's something that can be unbuilt and rebuilt in different ways. And I start in a similar way with the sort of micro understanding of the things that we already know when it comes to policing and when it comes to these broader questions about how we care for one another, which is to say, we don't call the police on our family very often, right? If we have conflicts, we de-escalate them, we have conversations, we're capable of looking at one another as objects of care and as providers of care for ourselves when we need it, right? We're capable of asking strangers for help when we need it, of giving help when strangers need it. And we've got these sort of micro understandings of what care could and should look like. We've just got this kind of imaginative blockage, which again is also a material blockage of what it would look like to make that a macro governing structure of society, right? How is it that we scale up from the abolition that we know, right? The egalitarianism that we know, the world without police that we can spend a lot of time in, right? Like you can spend, depending on where you live, a great deal of time without encountering or calling or interacting with the police. And yet for whatever reason, we think that they're always there, and we think that we always need them to be there. So making that leap is a very difficult one, right? And again, it's a leap in terms of our sort of like imaginary horizon of possibility, but it's also a material leap. And the good thing is that when people do make these turns and these decisions, which is to say, I'm not going to work solely for individual profit, I'm going to work for something that I think will have a social benefit, they're putting themselves automatically into a space in which different criteria apply, a space into which different alternatives might be visible. And insofar as we can begin to make those alternatives, more abolitionist, more radical, we've got the possibility of not, it's not educating yourself out of or learning your way out of the sort of police, the policing, mass incarceration apparatus, but beginning to think in ways that open up doors toward different levels of understanding.
Let me use an example that may further this particular discussion concerning our local communities and policing of these local communities. So again, it's a local Australian example, and obviously it will resonate with you in one way or another. So in Australia, this community social initiative, as you like, was implemented. It's called Neighborhood Watch. Wherever you go through your neighborhood, through your suburb, and Australia is very suburban, right? So all these invisible suburbs, more and less posh, they just spread it around vast areas of land. And in any suburb, you'll see like a little sign, like a traffic, looks like a traffic sign, but it's just a picture of a couple of silhouettes of the faces. It starts from like just a regular human, kind of a generic face, and on the other end, so there's like say 3 or 4 faces, silhouettes, and on the other end there is a police officer wearing the cap. And so the message is like, watch out, you are responsible to a degree about what is happening in your community. So if you take notice of any suspicious activity, you know whom to call. And these suspicious activities obviously vary. It doesn't have to be, a person looking like a thief, for example. One day, to give you one example, I was having a nap in the park in a small town in East Gippsland in Victoria, and someone called a cop on me because normally no one is having a nap in that park. So someone thought that I am some hobo or whatever. And the cop came with his gun and everything and just checked my documents and said, like, that's what we do. We make sure everything is safe. And cases obviously vary from, I spoke with legalized cannabis a person who runs the party, and they got 7% of votes last year. So 1 out of 10 voted for them. And he's located in Nimbin, which is like an anarchist hub in Australia and Northern Rivers. And he said, like, people dob each other in all the time. And there was like an absolutely ludicrous case when 2 police officers just came for a random visit to see someone. It was like on the news, like a local paper. And there was just like a pot with cannabis on the porch. One of the police officers said, like, don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about it. Everyone smokes dope here. And the other cop dobbed him in for that. So that's the kind of a neighborhood watch culture. And you can get in trouble for anything, like for cats being outside, for, there's so many regulations of the council around here that if you don't follow the rules, you'd never know whether your neighbor next door, who you say hi every morning and have a little chat, would dob you in for that, because it's so common and so normal.
I mean, it's snitch culture, right? Like it's an absolute internalization of the cop inside your head at all times. And of course, these things are very difficult, right? Because it's like on the one hand, we've all got that, built into our brains. But on the other hand, like part of that is real, right? Like part of it is like we do want society to operate in a way that, we think is valuable. There are disagreements about that. There's this idea of how to establish rules and enforce those rules onto others. And sometimes that's good, right? Sometimes it's like, unions historically have enforced very strict rules, especially during strikes, onto their communities, right? In ways that are coercive, of course, but necessary and ultimately geared toward sort of the kind of society we want to build. But community watch, and here's where I like to distinguish, because maybe I'll take a bit of a step back, which is to say I make a particular effort to insist that we're not abolishing the police to replace them with nothing, right? And I don't think anyone really believes that, although it's a sort of rhetorical tendency within certain sort of anarchist segments of the abolitionist community that's built on an understanding that if we simply withdraw the police as a repressive force, the community is sort of ready and prepared to sort of govern itself in a non-coercive way. I think that's a sort of conceptual, philosophical misunderstanding. I think it's a practical misunderstanding. And also I think it's a political non-starter, right? I live in West Philadelphia. If you go speak to your neighbors about whether or not what would happen when if the police were immediately withdrawn, that'd be, they would laugh you out of the room. But the point is not to say, but at the same time, I'm for the immediate withdrawal of the police, but in a context in which we're constructing actively different alternatives for self-defense, for community protection. That raises an incredibly complex difficulty, which is how does that new structure differ from the police on the one hand, but also how does it differ from sort of parapolice, the history of parapolice structures like neighborhood watch or community watch programs in the US, which have always essentially been, on the one hand, parapolice, meaning that they work directly with the police and in conjunction with the police. But the reason that they do so is because they also uphold whiteness and class privilege, to the same degree, right? Neighborhood watch has almost always been a sort of middle class policing of the community to keep an eye out for kind of undesirables that need to be then excluded right? There are very few exceptions, and there's always, and this I understand is kind of a permanent, permanent threat to community self-protection, which is how do you prevent your community patrols or whatever you've got, in the absence of police, from reproducing this tendency. And in some ways, that there are good examples of inclusive patrols or patrols that are sort of these multiracial, multi-class, self-defense community patrols. This was happening during Minneapolis when the police actively withdrew from the city of Minneapolis. And these kind of multiracial patrols were going around, and they were doing things like preventing certain kinds of harm from being perpetrated by young people, but not handing those people over to the cops, right? Encouraging them not to burn community centers and community spaces, and encouraging them to go home and bringing them to their parents instead of bringing them to the police. And these are kind of just very, very small examples of, of a complete sort of opposition between a community watch logic and a real community self-defense logic. And again, like there's this sort of seemingly blurry space between the two, but it's important to understand the very sharp differences that this blurriness reflects, right? You could say the same thing about so-called community policing, right? Because it's a tempting argument to say we want the police to be as integrated into communities as possible. We want them to be very much part of the communities, but what community policing has always meant is fragmenting the power of the community, sapping that power, attempting to infiltrate it, break it up, turn people against each other, create snitches. And, ultimately, if in theory, if you push that far enough, what happens is the police cease to be police entirely, right? They just become community members. But here's the difference. The definition for me, the defining feature of the police is that this is a professional force from outside the community that stands above the community and against it, right? Insofar as we as community are getting together, making decisions more or less democratic, ideally more democratic, about how to take care of one another, the question is not a formal question. Are we wearing uniforms? Do we call ourselves police? Do we use the means of violence or practices that might be understood as coercive or violent? The question is who is doing it and how, right? And that's the kind of self-defense that we need to start thinking about. And it stands directly opposed to these community watches, which are effectively police by another name.
Wow, I'm learning a lot. I'm learning a lot. I honestly don't. I think Geo's really kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think he's completely right that we need to think about how we're going to replace forms of community safety, which doesn't create a set of people or organizations or institutions which are above other members of society, but instead are a part of that society. But I think we can also think about how, while we do have the cop in our head, right, who's kind of telling us to snitch, we also do have the kind of a set of moral faculties in our head as well, which can also tell us when something isn't right? Whether it be the police doing something wrong or anybody else. And I think it's about organizers and campaigners appealing to that voice in our head, which tells us actually, maybe this set of institutions aren't keeping us as safe as they were, because otherwise, I wouldn't be living in the United States with the biggest, police force in the industrialized world, and it wouldn't be so dangerous to live here, right? For instance, and so I think we can. I think thinking through the problems of the police officer in our head. And how that can lead to us sinking into a new form of policing, even if we do get rid of formal police institutions, is a really crucial question. And it's about thinking about what other kinds of people or ideas or positions might inform us as well.
Beautiful. Well, I have a follow-up question for you, Adam, if you don't mind, and obviously Geo is more than happy if you step in as well. There is an important correlation to me between the origin of the police, as we discussed, which hinges on the protection of the property of the privileged classes. So the question of the private property is absolutely crucial, particularly in relation to the contemporary discussion of the community and ways and changing radically ways of thinking about our social and community organization. To what degree do you think the significance of the police in our societies, in our communities, depends on us embracing private property as a foundational unit for organizing our daily lives and relations with one another.
It's a really important question. So I might talk about Britain for a little bit, but I think it's applicable in other places. So we really see the rise of policing as a crucial electoral tool in Britain by Margaret Thatcher's government. You see it a little bit in the 1970s with the Labour Party, but Margaret Thatcher takes it to a new level, right? Where it becomes becomes the top 3 election issue, right? Above wages, above housing, above other things which were more often big electoral issues. But this comes alongside another project by Margaret Thatcher, a project which she called the right to buy. And in the 1970s in Britain, huge numbers of people lived in what you guys might call public housing, and it was seen highly respectable to live in a public housing block, which had been paid for by the taxpayer, which had plumbing and electricity and communal green spaces, and was considered architecturally modern and progressive. And what she said is, look, I'm going to enable you to buy your public housing property, the apartment or the house in which you live, for a very, very cheap rate, so you can become a property owner. And so what Margaret Thatcher was doing here was simultaneously escalating the power of the police and the fear of crime, particularly so-called immigrant crime, while also trying to create a nation of property owners, even among the working classes. And often these two sets of policies are thought about quite separately, right? But I think we could think about them as serving mutually beneficial for the Thatcher government's purposes, right? Because on the one hand, you're escalating the fear of criminality, particularly from so-called immigrants, particularly black communities, while at the same time creating a class of people who are now more likely to be concerned about their loss of property, or be concerned about securing their property, understanding their home as not being something which is owned collectively through public ownership, but something which is personal to them and their own family. And so the more the government or the state or economic system is able to create a relationship with property which is personal rather than collective, the greater they can create a reliance, or a perceived reliance, I think, on the police and prison system. And I think we can think about that in other parts of the world, particularly the United States, right, where there's very little public housing, and therefore more a greater focus, or a prizing of private property, right? Which means that more people want private property, and therefore need it protecting. And I think therefore the greater we can collectivize things like housing or other kinds of public spaces, the more people think about them in a collective manner, and therefore it being a collective responsibility to look after them, rather than it being someone's personal property, which therefore requires them to rely on a police force due to fear of it being taken away from them by another individual through theft or whatever it might be.
I love that description, Adam, and it's really interesting because it really resonates with like long-term patterns of like colonization and colonialism. Is like an explicit project of how indigenous communities were destroyed across the Americas, was this sort of destruction of community through the creation of individuals, right? Turning, whether it's in Latin America, turning indigenous people into peasants, or in the United States, sort of the whitening displacement process, the theft of children, this sort of the entire process. And so it seems really interesting and resonates as this long-term process. And I think what we do have in the U.S. today is this sort of hyper version of that, but what's also like, reveals, I think, the deep racialization of it, right? Which is that it's like property for some, right? Like actually, and there's this tension in capital, right? Because capital sort of wants, profit, but that profit can be derived in different ways, and sometimes it's profitable. I mean, for example, a lot of the ways in which I was thinking the case of Oakland in particular, where like redlining is broken down by the profit motive of sort of real estate developers who want to sell, to Black families, because they can charge them more, right? Like they can actually, and this is part of how segregation is broken down in certain ways through that profit motive. But on the other hand, of course, we know very often that these things move in the opposite direction. And it also raises this bigger question of how the economic fits with the racial, which I think is crucial. And I think the construction of that individual subjectivity is crucial and powerful. But again, it hits its sort of crisis points, as well. One crisis point, of course, could be the 2008 housing crisis. And sort of like, prior to that, there were all these junk loans being given primarily to communities of color, which then they default on, lose their homes, and huge amounts of money are sucked out of those very same communities. Of course, the profit is already made by the banks, and so there's no loss to the system. But also raises the question of, I think, and there's debates in the U.S. in particular about the term, prison industrial complex and what it meant. And I think, I think of someone like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore as posing a sort of critique of that language, in part because there's an implication that the sort of like surface level profit motive or the surface level property question is the economic question in toto, right? When in reality, in other words, how is it that prisons create profit for private producers of goods for sale, right? Like, how is it that so-called prison slavery becomes a way to extract labor and create profit, which it does. But I think part of her concern was that this is a very narrow understanding of the economic, because part of what's happening is that entire countries and social structures are being reoriented and restructured, right? This was she puts it, a geographical. So mass incarceration was a geographical solution to an economic problem that involved the dramatic infusion of state money, right? Not the withdrawal of the state, but from the 50s and 60s onward, the infusion of state money into this sort of like, so-called underdeveloped white areas of the US in a way that creates its own constituency, creates its own economic motive, creates its own rationale. And there it becomes jobs, right? It becomes questions of like, the ways in which prisons are providing jobs, or the ways in which policing is a job, right? A different side of the economic piece, right? Which is not the property question, but the sort of employment income question. And all the while, of course, the state is becoming racialized as something that hands out money to, undeserving communities of color. And private capital and private initiative and individualism becomes hyper-racialized as white, right? And so it's just, the way in which the two pieces, I think, operate hand in hand to incredibly destructive extremes, particularly in the United States, but of course elsewhere as well, I think is resonant.
Thanks a lot for your responses. There are about two more questions that we should consider today. I will keep pushing my skeptical line, if you don't mind. It's very important to be able to see and feel the world through the eyes of other people, and in our circumstances through the eyes of regular conscientious citizens. And it's hard to dispute the fact of racial violence being entrenched in the ways of thinking of the police officers and in their actions. A really huge thing popped up recently, for example, that Australian police has a little manual, training manual, which says at some point something to the effect of the stolen generations, which is an Australian version of eugenics, from where indigenous people were taken from their families and bred with white people. It only stopped in 70s, as far as I can remember. So the 2023 police manual has a line saying something to the effect that this is one of the best things that happened to indigenous people. So that was on the news everywhere, and like, this is so fucked up, and it's really happening. And the Australian police, up until now, hasn't had any cultural training. So now the negotiations between the enraged indigenous communities, and the police have kind of a push forward the agenda that there needs to be some cultural training in place, and they will get 3.5-hour classes about cultural training out of the entire degree. So this is where we're at with respect to racial capitalism and police in Australia. And nonetheless, it's an important kind of a background information to regular people perceiving police as being a legitimate force in their community, as protective forces against all kinds of criminal activities. And there's a few of them in the drug scene, drug industry, domestic violence, another example, sexual industry like child pornography, serial killers, and so on. So how do we envisage our communities, big cities in particular, without the police force when we have to deal with things like that in the everyday?
Well, there are lots of examples that you gave there. I think drugs is a really useful one. And I think that's a useful one partly because there are lots of real world examples of how drugs have been dealt with. And one of the best examples is probably Portugal, but there are others as well, in which Portugal has relatively recently decriminalized all drugs. Regardless of what it is might be, or how we perceive the perceived effects that they have on our minds or our bodies, or whatever it might be, and they treat drug use as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. And this has led to a massive decrease in the kind of harm and violence which of course often takes place when it comes in relation to criminalized activity, like the dissemination of criminalized drugs. But it also improves safety, right? People are able to have their drugs tested, see if they've been cut with anything harmful. They are able to more accurately know exactly how much of a drug that they are consuming, because they can have those things more accurately measured. They can get clean needles if they use needles in order to consume drugs, so to prevent the spread of infectious diseases and other forms of harm. There are a whole swathe of there are mountains of evidence which prove pretty much without exception that the decriminalization of drugs and the treating of drug use as a public health matter rather than a criminal justice matter is better for everyone. It is better for the drug user. It is better for people who sell drugs in order for them to gain an income, but it's also better for the rest of society as well. And so I think this is one way in which we can think about drugs, which of course is one of the key justifications for expansions in police and prison power, but it's also one of the key reasons that people are incarcerated, particularly in countries like Britain and the United States. So I think this is a really useful and I think powerful argument against the expansion of police and prison power, which I think is really easy to evidence, but also I think appeals to people on multiple levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and and on the drug piece, I think again it's a great example. To push a little more on the question of on the prohibition side of it, right? Not just the use side, or the of course decriminalization is massively important, but I mean, I always think in terms of the border. I always think in terms of the ways in which prohibition and prohibition in the U.S. has been so massively destructive in terms of the drug trade, in the transnational drug trade in the Americas, because you see over the course of 50 or 60 years the ways in which enforcement leads to massive increases in the death count, right? Drug prohibition has led to, and border enforcement has led to, even in the past 30 years, something easily on the order of 500,000 dead in the so-called, war on the cartels in Mexico, in the ways in which governments have tried to crack down on drug trafficking, but, at every step knowing that it won't work, right? At every step knowing that for example, when Reagan shuts down Miami as a space as an entry point for drug flights directly from Colombia, those drugs will then transit through, land routes in Mexico, which have created just a level of carnage that is really kind of unprecedented and astonishing, and that there's no way to stop the growth and the power of Mexican cartels, say, if that's our goal even, without decriminalizing and without, reconsidering the way that the border is enforced. Why? Because it's criminalization in conjunction with the border that creates the massive profit potential of the drug trade, right? It is the border that makes these drugs worth what they're worth. And we see very, clear examples of small level decriminalization of marijuana in the United States leads to a collapse in the price, and leads to the fact that, many, Mexican cartels that hadn't already abandoned marijuana immediately, ceased to produce it and started to produce other things that were more profitable, right? More profitable because they're easily transportable, easier to smuggle across the border. It is the border that creates that, right? So for me, and this is raised an important point, which is that police abolition is also border abolition. It's also border patrol, border enforcement abolition. Again, this is a big project, but it's a project that we need to understand the same way. And there are direct parallels, right? Not only in the historical way that the policing of sort of brown migrants paralleled and went directly in conjunction with the policing of sort of mostly largely Black urban populations. The fact that border enforcement emerges in a very sharp way in the mid-90s under the sort of Clintonite right turn of the Democratic Party, at the same time that, the sort of mass incarceration bills and, the criminalization of, so-called super predator young Black, people is being, established. But also in the way that the border and police are both apparent solutions and presented as solutions to problems that they themselves create, right? Problems that they create by restructuring how our lives work, by creating different kind of motives, by creating violence, by injecting violence into communities and then claiming they're the only things that can stop that violence. The violence of the border that we talk about all the time in the American press in particular would not exist if the border went back even to what it used to be 100 years ago, which was a kind of non-existent line in the sand in which people crossed all the time, right? It's only when you put up the border that the value of crossing that border increases exponentially, and the profit motive becomes the source for, even if we talk about something like South Central Los Angeles in the 90s and the massive violence between the Bloods and the Crips, what's happening? They're being armed. And the heavy weaponry that's being provided is only possible because of the amount of money that's being produced by this sort of, drug distribution profit motive that exists at the time. So we need to really rethink the way in which criminalization creates that violence that it claims to be preventing. As to, in some ways, the other pieces that you have brought in, I think it's important to point toward the question of this sort of the extreme narratives used to justify policing, right? And you brought up sort of child abuse, you brought up sort of, sexual assault, domestic violence. We think about things in the US, there's also this constant narrative that, well, what do you do with the people who are absolutely evil and the sort of serial killers, and what do you do? Do you not imprison them? And I think these are, on the one hand, a ruse and a sort of like, bad faith attempt to justify these sort of systems. Because we know, for example, that policing does almost nothing to stop domestic violence. If anything, we know that, huge numbers of police are themselves domestic abusers, inflict more violence on women than they prevent. But it's important in the sense that we need to, again, craft our understanding of abolition around a political narrative that, that really addresses these questions, which is to say, what? We don't know in the medium term what these things look like, right? We don't know how many people need to be ostracized, held, or surveilled in the short term as we rebuild the kind of society that we want to have, right? What we do know is that it's not the vast majority of the people in prison, right? Like we're talking about in the US, up to 2 million people in prison, the vast majority of whom, of course, are nonviolent, the vast majority of those so-called violent offenders, are, engaged, in things that they would never, commit again, or, that reflect the outgrowth of the kind of lifestyle that was given to them and the sort of economic opportunities that were given to them. So what do we do, when we are talking about extreme cases that justify policing and incarceration? we're talking about, first of all, dramatically shrinking the prison population, dramatically shrinking the presence of police on our streets, and then being able to think in a more clear-headed way about what our communities need in terms of protection, right? And how to really and concretely address those, because we have the same problem here, right? Which is to say, most of the solutions that are offered, everyone knows that they're not going to work. Everyone knows that it's a fake solution, but it's a politically sort of viable and politically sort of useful proposal or solution, right? For example, in the present, we've got this massive lie that the reason that violence is going up in some cities, or had been going up, was because of defunding, when we know that there's been no defunding, right? We have this massive lie that says we need more police. If our society is getting more violent, we need more police. And it doesn't ask the question of, well, what about all the police and all of the growth in policing that's happened over the past 40 years? And the fact that, society is still not as safe as you would want it to be, right? The persistence of, that kind of violence is the biggest, counterpoint to the justification for policing. And yet it's never presented that way because of this sort of sort of magical argument that police proponents, engage in.
Thanks a lot, Geo. And your comments will help us to move into the concluding phase of our discussion. I guess I could frame it in this way. What would be the basic foundational stepping stones, baby steps, if you like, that you would propose to a given community skeptical about your views, just habitually skeptical? What would you propose them to test your ideas? So say the police forces are still there, the state provides all kinds of incentives for the police as the body to grow and expand, but yet there is some nascent doubt within the community. What practical ways would you propose to the members of the community, whether it's a neighborhood, suburb, to try to implement these changes in ways of thinking together and being and organizing and so on?
That's a great final question. So I think there's two ideas and then maybe some more practical things. There's a great organizer in the US. I think there's a group of organizers in the US who often get people to do a kind of mind exercise where they ask them to close their eyes and think about the most secure and safe place that they've ever been to for them. Where do they feel safe? Where do they feel relaxed? Right? And they ask everyone to close their eyes and have a think where they feel safe, relaxed, comfortable, at ease. And they ask everyone to open their eyes and they ask them, okay, so so what did you guys have? People say, I was at my grandparents' house, or I was in my local church, or I was with my friends at the beach, or something like that. And they say, okay, so who had cops in prisons in their place, right? And generally, unless you're a bit of a fascist, no one basically says yes, right? And then we go from there by saying, okay, so when we think about the places, maybe in the city or the area we live in, where these are the safest, are they the communities that have cops in every corner, where their people live under the greatest threat of imprisonment? Or are they the communities where most people have a relatively decent paying job, where they have access to education if they want it, and where they have access to healthcare, including mental health support, where they have secure housing? And the answer is generally yes, right? They'll probably be the wealthier suburbs, where people have access to all of those kinds of things, right? So we can see already that actually the things that we need to live safely aren't cops on every corner and living under the constant threat of imprisonment, right? They are the fundamental things that we need to live a dignified existence. And then we can go from there by saying, okay, so practically, how can we build those things around us? Well, we can think, okay, so how do we build more secure jobs? Or maybe we can join our union and help to secure people's jobs and improve their pay and conditions. Oh, right. What about mental health? Well, okay, are there community mental health institutions, and how can we support them? And if there aren't, how can we build them and make them robust? And if they're not formally mental health institutions, what other things help with our mental health? Green space, youth clubs, music, arts and culture, supporting people who need childcare support or support of other kinds of care and responsibilities. All of these things can improve our mental health. And so we can think about other ways in which we can do that, right? And so there are lots of ways in which already people are doing work which erodes society's reliance on the police and prison system, because they can help people. They are helping people already to improve their mental and emotional well-being, improve their likelihood of having a secure and stable and meaningful set of employment conditions, improving their access to housing if they work at a renters union or whatever it might be, or another kind of advocacy group. People are already doing that kind of work. So for me, really, it's about seeing what kind of work is already out there, which makes people's lives more secure and more safe and erodes society's reliance on police and prisons, and think about that work as having more potential than maybe we've already understood it as having, and think about it as being connected up to a wider project which provides community-led forms of safety and care, but also a wider vision which can work towards making police and prisons, as we said at the top of this conversation, obsolete.
Yes, no, absolutely. And again, you've got to say the two pieces, right? The abolition and the tearing down, and the reconstruction, the building up. And in some ways, the reconstruction is always happening, right? Where, and this is one thing I think that, Adam pointed to that I think needs to be emphasized, which is that abolition is already there. I mean, it's in the form of this sort of like these alternatives, in the form of community organizations and all of the, all the services and outlets and spaces and community spaces and activities for youth and all these things that need to exist, right? We even have many in the U.S. Examples of community organizations that are directly intervening to prevent violence, to mediate conflicts, and these are the kind of things that need to be sort of dramatically ramped up. At the same time, you've got this question of simultaneously working to tear down repressive and carceral institutions, which is something that's more sort of periodic, right? You have waves of rebellion and resistance that give us opportunities, I think, to strike blows against these institutions, right? Just a couple of years ago, particularly in these sort of mass rebellions in 2020, we had a sort of golden opportunity to make some headway. And the question is, how do you do both of these things at once, and how do you contribute to both of these tasks, even though, of course, everyone's going to be working in a different kind of capacity? I think it's important to emphasize, on the one hand, the distinction that many mark, I think quite rightly, between reformist reforms and sort of potentially abolitionist reforms, right? Because we're not in a position where we can wait for the total and sudden abolition of these institutions. We need to talk about how to weaken them, right? But we need to be very careful, because many reforms that are offered, almost all of the reforms that are offered by the system, are reforms that uphold and even strengthen policing, right? Whether it's new technological questions, body cameras, whether it's training, which infuses huge amounts of money into police, whether it's more police, whether it's community policing, all these things. These are all strengthening the police, right? Giving them more resources, giving them more legitimacy. However, there are those sort of reforms that can point in a different direction, reforms that withdraw police from communities, that reduce their kind of funding, that curtail their powers and their impunity. And these are the kind of changes that I think definitely can support. And here you've got this sort of bridge in between, which is often referred to as kind of defunding campaigns, but which I think for me is incredibly important, because it allows for a way to mobilize around the reduction of police budgets on the one hand, which in and of itself would be beneficial, but not only for the concrete reduction and the reduction of sort of contact between oppressed communities and the police, but also because you can then point to that defunding and say, listen, like, your lives have not gotten worse, right? They've not gotten more dangerous as a result of these millions of dollars that have been withdrawn from the police budget. But the real key is that those resources are then reinvested into community alternatives to policing, right? Providing them the opportunities for people to see on a local level how their lives have actually gotten better, right? Not only safer, because that's also a subjective thing, but also more community oriented, right? Like the sense that you've got someone else to call, the sense that you've got someone in your neighborhood, and a kind of cohesion, a kind of fabric of community that makes the police, again, obsolete, less present, less relevant. They don't need to be called, and to have those alternatives in place, and to have them, gaining access to the resources that the police are currently sucking out of budgets and extracting from communities is the key to the question of defunding, I think, that we need to think about. So if you're talking about concrete things, in the immediate, future, these are the kind of things to build up these alternatives, to increase campaigns, to demand that the resources that are being, again, expropriated from communities collectively and handed to the police be handed back to those communities, right? To build these kinds of alternatives and do so in sort of ever more kind of democratic ways.
Fantastic. Thank you both. One final point I just wanted to say before we conclude, possibly we have already concluded, we'll see. What I am concerned with in general is how to communicate these ideas, and that's why through all kinds of philosophical projects, I'm just trying to find mediums, how you can communicate these ideas so they resonate with people. And one thing I'm sure about, we certainly live in the world that is dominated by white discourse, and white discourse is verbal discourse. We talk, we reason all the time, we come up with policies, counter policies, reasons, arguments, counter arguments, and the whole academia is structured around that, essentially. And one thing we can certainly learn from anti-colonial or decolonial thinking and ways of being is to cut talking a little bit down and engage in what we call embodied artistic experiences. I think what really unites us often is not just necessarily our solidarity at some conceptual level, but things that we do together. And arts and aesthetics are certainly heavily misrepresented in the white world, dominated by logical, by logos, by this discourse. And people can connect greatly, most intimately through, dance and all kinds of artistic activities together. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to play for you something, whether you have any responses to that, it's up to you. If you have any, it's great. If not, we just can conclude with that. It's on the topic of police. I'm not sure how many of your books, which I highly recommend to everyone, you've sold, but this video, so taking place in London in 2021, this video has 4.7 million views around the world. So this is Brutalismus 3000. It's a duo from Berlin. And to me, what they're doing is great. It's comparable to what you do, but at the level of aesthetics, when certain simple messages become communicated not through some high-flowing and, again, important discourse. We need that because that's the world in which we live, the world of white supremacy. But to counter that, I think we should pay attention to projects like this one. All right, so the message is clear, you know, no sex with cops. And 4 million views, and it's pretty simple, and it's a, you know, community event. Again, there's no distance really between the performer and the audience. They're all one, and they're all singing along. And to me, that's pretty powerful, and it sinks in through the body, not just through the mind.